Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this presentation today. It is entitled State of the Ponds. For those who do not know me, my name is Jane Crowley. I'm the Director of Health and the Environment. I've been working for the town for a very long time, which makes me old. But I just really want to thank you today for joining us. And before I introduce our speaker today, our consultant, Liz Moran, I wanted to just take a moment to thank the people that really have made this work possible. And that is our volunteers. Many of you I have had the pleasure to know and work with over these last 18 years. And it is because of you that we are able to reflect back and look at the health and condition of our ponds and our resources and make improvements as we move forward in the future. So when I started thinking about how much work that actually involved, last year alone, we collected water samples for 48 events. So if you just roughly, try to calculate what that's worth in terms of dollars, and you add the time and training that these individual volunteers, you, the citizens of Eastham, put in, we're looking at about $2,600 worth of labor just last year alone. And if you calculate that out over the long-term monitoring and evaluation that's gone on in this effort, we're looking at over $50,000 worth of volunteer time from you in our community. So this tells me you care. You really care about your community, our community. And this tells me you care about our resources. So that's why we're here today. And I think it proves the adage that by working together, we can make a difference. These are hard problems to solve, but they are solvable problems. So I just really want to deeply thank everyone for the effort that you've extended, for the partnerships that we've had over the years, and I hope that with all of these kind words, you will continue to do so in the future, because I really need your help. And so many of you have been in this from the very beginning. Thank you. So without any further ado, I'm here to introduce Liz Moran, who is the principal scientist of Ecologic. Their company has been in existence, founded in 1997. And again, I've had a long working relationship with Liz. In the beginning, our projects involved GHD, or Stearns and Wheeler, which was their predecessor. And Liz herself is an expert in this field. She holds an MS in aquatic science and a PhD in water resources from Cornell University. Her extensive professional experience in water resources with a focus on limnology, water quality, protecting and restoring lakes and watersheds makes her the perfect person to assist us in these projects. Liz has worked with the town of Eastham since 2011. Some of this previous work involved development of the action plan. Many of you were intimately involved in that work effort, and that laid the pathway for our town going forward to prioritize which water bodies we would concentrate in on first. So with that effort, the grounding work of developing an action plan, we did restoration projects which were successfully completed, including Herring Pond and Great Pond. So today I've tasked Liz with 3 different items to discuss. One is, what is the current condition of our ponds, to update that action plan that we developed in 2011 with all of this great data that we've collected in the more recent years. Secondly, I've asked her to discuss the status of Salt Pond. Many of you are involved in freshwater sampling and saltwater sampling. The saltwater sampling is a little more rigid It's not flexible. We do this regionally and cooperatively with other communities, including the Pleasant Bay Alliance and the town of Orleans. So that is a real regional effort and works on a very determined schedule. So that water quality work of the saltwater estuary is creating the work plan for our wastewater remediation work and planning going forward. So it's all interrelated, and it's a good opportunity to combine all of that data evaluation. So Liz is going to help us work through that as well. And lastly, we're here to discuss remediation's approach for Schoolhouse Ministers Pond. We had prioritized the ponds back in the action plan, and this is the next pond water body that is in the forefront for a remediation strategy. So I'm going to just kick it over to Liz, and she's open to questions. And again, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. If you can't hear me in the back, wave at me. We don't have our mics today, so I'm going to stand up and try to project a little bit out of my normal soft-spoken persona. So we are here, as Jane said, to talk about three kind of interrelated subjects regarding our freshwater resources and our saltwater resources and the future really of our ponds on Cape Cod here in Eastham. So I'm going to start out with an update on our what we call the inland kettle ponds. So these are the 11 ponds that were included in the action plan from 2011 that Ecologic, my firm, worked with GHD on. We were asked to evaluate the current conditions and trends in these 11 ponds within the town, kind of think about and screen alternatives for what might be done to intervene in ponds where water quality was deteriorating or an issue. We had a lot of community conversations and workshops regarding how do we set priorities among all of these 11 ponds and which types of restoration actions are going to be most attractive to our community of Eastham, and then come up with a defined path toward implementation. So I recognize many of you and thank you for coming today, and I should have started with this. Thank you, Jane, for the opportunity to continue working with this interesting community and natural resources. But when we talk about the inland kettle ponds, we talk a lot about phosphorus. Now we'll switch that conversation a little bit when we get to salt pond, because in the estuarine world, we worry more about nitrogen. But for the freshwater ponds, the kettle ponds in the interior of the town of Eastham, phosphorus is the key kind of to pond health. So higher levels of phosphorus are associated with more primary productivity. So that's the growth of algae and plants, the producers that photosynthesize. If there's too much of a good thing, the pond water quality starts to deteriorate. So elevated concentrations of phosphorus lead to excessive levels of algae. When that algae and other plants then die and sink to the bottom, the microbial community that breaks them down uses up oxygen. So you have a kind of accelerating system where if you have phosphorus, low concentrations of phosphorus, have very clear water because there's not a lot of algae interfering with water clarity, and it's well oxygenated. You know, there's not a lot of oxygen demand from decaying plant material. And in terms of fisheries and recreation, if your pond is deep enough, the deep water can be cool enough and have enough oxygen to support cold water fisheries, so trout, for example. Then, as phosphorus concentrations start to creep up, you start to get less water clarity, and you can start to lose oxygen in the deep water from the decay of the plant material. Now, these scales, these numbers are just kind of not hard and fast numbers. It's kind of relative scale. So, but in general, increasing phosphorus over about 20 to 25, the scale says ppb, that's parts per billion, which is the same as micrograms per liter. So you'll see a lot of data kind of on this scale. Then you start to see diminished clarity, more plants, less oxygen, less attractive for recreation, less attractive to dive in and swim. The fish community will shift to a warmer water fish community because the cold water deep in the pond doesn't have enough oxygen. So you tend to have, the fish community is dominated by species that are tolerant of warmer water. And then as phosphorus continues to increase, you can reach levels where you have persistent algal blooms, you can have harmful algal blooms or cyanobacteria. We'll talk about that briefly later on. And then that becomes less attractive for people to use. You can have fish gills less attractive for the aquatic community. So phosphorus, that's the key. And probably this is a review for many of you, but if you have a question or I'm talking too much jargon or you want some clarification, please speak up. So in our 2011 action plan, we took our 11 ponds, here they are, kind of arrayed here in alphabetical order, from Bridge to Widow Harding, and we just checked a box of which of the ponds meet these goals for kind of recreation, water quality, aquatic life related goals. So dissolved oxygen, is it greater than 4? So 4 is kind of a transition point for fish, that if it gets to be 4 or under, that's very stressful for aquatic life, so that's why we picked that number. Water clarity greater than 2 meters. So water clarity, I know all of you PALS volunteers are very familiar with the Secchi disc. Water clarity is a standard measure where you lower a disc into the water and see how long it takes or how deep it is before it disappears. You can't see it anymore. So higher water clarity is associated with less algae, better swimming. So the standard that we picked for that is greater than 2 meters. Phosphorus, as I said, remember phosphorus is the key. We picked a cutoff of 10 micrograms per liter. And then chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll is a measure of algal pigments. So you don't count the number of algae suspended in the water. You take a water sample, extract the algal pigments, and then measure chlorophyll. So 8 is a kind of a standard measure for that. Do you have a question?
On
Yeah.
this chart, a check is good or a check is bad?
A check is good. A check means that dissolved oxygen is greater than 4.
Okay.
Water clarity is greater than 2. And I know that's confusing because when we did the action plan, I did it the other way, right?
Just wanted to
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, I thought I'd just keep you all on track today by switching the scale. So on this one then, the count of how many checks did you get, higher numbers of checks mean better water, lower, 0, so Herring Pond had 0 and Schoolhouse had 0, based on the 2011 action plan. Okay? I'm glad you paid so much attention. So then we said, okay, we have 11 ponds. They're all in different states of impairment. Nobody had 4 check marks on that last chart. So how do we decide which ones to address first? And we decided that really that's both a science question. Science side, we looked at the current water quality conditions and trends. Again, fortunately, with the PALS data set extending back in time, we were able to see how things are changing over the years. And then the policy considerations, we thought about how does Mass DEP think about use attainment? When we did the 2011 action plan, only Great Pond was listed by Mass DEP as an impaired water body for whatever reason. The Mass DEP, we use that as a criterion, but it's kind of evolving over time. So ownership and access, are these just private ponds? Is there public access? How big are they? And have they been treated before? Has the town previously invested in some kind of remedial measure for this pond? So we kind of tossed those around with Jane and her department, the Water Management Committee, at various public workshops that we had, and decided that those are reasonable criteria. And then we just did a kind of a ranking, 1, 2, 3, for these various criteria. So on the science side, how impaired is it? Where are the algae levels? The next one I put in red because we didn't particularly specifically call it out in 2011, the regulatory status. Projected future without intervention, improving, stable, declining, ownership, could be private, it could be mix of public and private, or it could be public, the amount of access, the size, and then previously treated. So all of those criteria got a 1, 2, 3 scale. So it was very easy for us then to go ahead and set our priorities, assign those priority factors, and rank them into, which were pretty obvious actually given the current water quality. Great Pond and Herring Pond turned out to be high priorities. Herring Pond mostly because of the water quality degradation, the trend. Great Pond because of its size, importance, and public degree of public use, and the fact that phosphorus concentrations were also increasing. And Minister and Schoolhouse were also high priority items. And as we're going to talk about in a lot more detail today, it's challenging to deal with these shallow ponds. So Minister, Schoolhouse, it took us a while to come up with an action plan. But we have one, and we're going to talk about it today. So once we figured out our priorities, we thought about how do we decide the alternatives? What do we do? So there is a published compendium for New York, I'm from New York, Massachusetts Waters for remedial measures that are most effective for ponds. We looked at those. We wanted to pick solutions that specifically address the impairment that we were trying to solve, or the issue that we were trying to solve. So if the issue was too many weeds, you can't get to the water, find a path for that. If the issue is internal phosphorus loading is so high that we're having big algal blooms every year, find a solution that addresses that impairment. So again, tried to be very tailored to the problem we were trying to solve. And what we heard from the community is a lot of feedback about, tell us what works on Cape Cod. You know, we are one of many ponds, or many towns with ponds, and we're all struggling to find solutions. Let's make sure we build that body of knowledge and learn from our neighbors and get best practices for this particular region. How long would it be effective? What's the relative cost, the benefits, and the risks to both environmental health and human health? Outlook for permitting, is this something that's going to be acceptable to the Conservation Commission and DEP and other people who would have some kind of regulatory authority to issue a permit? And what does the community think? Is this something that's acceptable, given all of the benefits and risks and track record and costs? How amenable is this solution to the community? Because we're talking about investing public funds. So when we went through that screening of alternatives and prioritization, we decided to implement an alum treatment program on 2 ponds, Herring Pond, which we treated in 2012, and Great Pond, which was treated the subsequent year in 2013. Both of those treatments were done in the fall. So in Herring, this table shows kind of the treatment area for the alum, how many acres were treated. So not too different in Herring Pond and Great Pond, but different in terms of what percentage of the pond is represented in that treatment area. And the difference relates to the shape of the ponds, right? If Herring Pond is more of a bowl, it has a greater area of deep sediments that are overlain by water that loses its oxygen. So that's why you do an alum treatment. You add alum, which is aluminum sulfate plus sodium aluminate, to the ponds to in an effort to bind phosphorus that's currently in the sediments in the form of iron-bound phosphorus. Because what happens is when a pond loses its oxygen, there's chemical changes that happen that related to that iron-phosphorus complex that release the phosphorus into the overlying water. So by adding the alum, you're essentially binding up that phosphorus. So even when the pond runs out of oxygen in the bottom, the phosphorus is locked in the bottom. So in Herring Pond, we treated 45% of the bottom because there was a big area of the pond that was overlain by water that ran out of oxygen. In Herring Pond, we treated about the same number of acres, but because of the shape of the pond, it was got deep much more gradually, there was less area that was overlain by low oxygen water. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, good. And you'll also notice that the treatment doses were very different. Herring Pond we treated with fairly high dose. Greater Pond, much lower, a third of that dose. And the reason we did that was because as we were designing the treatment, we took sediment samples from the bottom of the pond and sent them to a specialty lab for assay. So they told us the iron-bound phosphorus concentration, and then they also did experiments of adding different doses of alum and figuring out the response curve. So how much alum do you have to add so that there's no more available phosphorus that's going to come out of that sediment? So based on that, we worked with Aquatic Control Technology, which is now part of Solitude, and a specialty lab in Agawam, Mass, to get all of these data. So what happened? Well, Herring Pond, I'm going to start with the good news story first, because Herring Pond had a great response to the alum treatment program. The treatment, as I said, was in 2012 in the fall. So this is Secudis transparency. So the longer the bars are, the deeper you can see into the water, right? So before the treatment, it was actually very low water transparency. The waters were very green and turbid and murky. From 2013, the first summer after the treatment, onward, continuing till now, we had exceptional water clarity in Herring Pond. And so that has been a real success story. We've heard a lot of positive feedback from the abutters. Yes? No? Okay, what would you add to that?
Because the last 3 years, the algae came back again, and they went up to the top.
The plants?
Yeah, I'm sorry, what did you say?
I said that the plants are back again, and the algae is back.
The plants were.
I fish the pond.
On her also.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I make a cast and I bring it in the lure, there is plants sticking to my lure.
Okay, so as the water gets clearer, light can penetrate deeper into the water, and that means that there's more habitat for aquatic plants, right? Because the macrophytes, they grow where sunlight hits the bottom of the pond. So as the water gets clearer, we have expanded the habitat for the macrophytes. But because the algae has essentially really been cut back, that was the problem that the alum was designed to solve. Any other comments on herring or?
Liz,
Yes,
you
Sandy.
distinguish between algae and rooted plants.
Yeah, so algae and phytoplankton, and which includes cyanobacteria, are the unicellular, mostly, plants that are suspended in the water column. So that's what, when you look into the water and it looks green and murky, that's because of algae typically. But the aquatic plants live in they draw their nutrition from the sediment, not from the water column typically. So they grow in the pond where light hits the surface of the sediment. And that's a natural part of the pond ecosystem. I mean, rooted macrophytes or aquatic plants are very important for stabilizing sediment. They're habitat for fish and the macroinvertebrates, the tiny animals that fish eat. So they add oxygen to the ponds. You know, they're an important part of the ecosystem. But again, just like algae, too much of a good thing turns into a bad thing. So that is something that we should really track and talk about with the herring pond abutters and users about their perceptions of is the pond still supporting its recreational uses? Yeah, you have a question.
So we moved down to Herring Pond in 2013, and I was here when they did the alum treatment. And so we've seen the grasses start to grow back. I've seen a little more murky. Is that the algae then that's suspended in the water that's making the murkiness? Or is it the aquatic plants that are growing?
It's probably the algae in the water. If you look through and it's not as clear, but you know, we have.
But we haven't seen any lily pads or anything like that back. And so,
No.
I think it's a success. How long though do we have before we have to do the next treatment?
Right.
That would be my follow-up question.
Yeah, that's a great question. The treatment actually was calculated to be effective for 10 years.
10 years.
But that doesn't mean that it's good for 10 and then everything goes to pot again. What that means is that after 10 years, you will gradually start to lose effectiveness. So we've had ponds on Cape Cod that were treated, 18 years ago before the community decided that it was time to do a second treatment. So again, it's not like a switch that turns on and off. There's a gradual loss of that binding capacity because the alum has a finite capacity to bind phosphorus. It's just based on its chemistry. So when that's used up, when all those binding sites are already used up, then you're going to start to see the phosphorus come back.
So as the butters on the pond, are there remediative processes that we can employ? Or where does most of the phosphorus come from?
I'll get to a slide on that. So on Herring Pond, most of the phosphorus that was really feeding these very, very bad conditions here was coming from the bottom sediments. So we
Stuff
did
was there
address,
for a long time.
right, it's like a legacy phosphorus.
Gotcha.
And that was addressed with the alum treatment program. But there are still continuing sources. There is stormwater runoff. There's runoff from lawns and geese. Thank you, whoever said that. Septic, groundwater. These ponds are fed by groundwater. So, we talk about water management of the surface water, but basically, this is all one connected system. So, anything that affects the quality of the groundwater or runs off into the ponds is going to affect the water quality.
I
Ma'am.
have trouble getting my arms around the fact that you got this huge pond, X number of acres, but you're only treating X number of acres. How do you know that the treatment is going to stay right there and not just go all over?
They have, yeah, that's a great question. The the technology is amazing. Where at that point, ACT is now Solitude, with their application barges, they're all controlled by GPS. They inject that alum deep into the pond. They don't just spread it on the surface, they actually inject it in. And we had people on the pond all the time while they were doing that and measuring conditions inside and outside the treatment area to make sure that there was not a loss or some kind of flux of that alum moving around. So yeah, no, it's amazing the control that they are actually able to exert. Okay, so I started with a good story, right? So Great Pond, you have to think of Great Pond, now think back, it was a low dose treatment, we treated a smaller part of the pond, and in fact, internal loading wasn't as big a percentage of the phosphorus budget. So we decided to proceed with Great Pond as kind of a proactive measure to say, okay, here's something we can control. We can control the deep water phosphorus release. So we're going to do that on Great Pond, even though it's a small dose treatment, because we know that this pond is very important to our community. So we did not see in Great Pond, the treatment was in 2013, right. So we're not seeing the dramatic improvement that we did in the Herring Pond. So if you look more closely at the data though, you can see that, so this is Great Pond, this is Herring Pond here. We have all the data since the action plan, and then I divided it up into the pre-treatment years and the post-treatment years. So these are slightly different for Herring Pond and Great Pond because they were treated 1 year apart. But this is what I want to show you and make this point, is that even though in Great Pond we didn't get as quick and great a response in terms of water clarity, the treatment itself was actually effective in dropping the phosphorus concentration that was in the deep water. So it went from 83 to 30 here after the treatment in Great Pond, and look what it did in Herring Pond. It went from hundreds of micrograms per liter or parts per billion down to about 20. So we see that here's the upper waters. This is where the sun shines and the algae grows. Very high phosphorus before treatment in Herring Pond and much lower after. Slightly higher in Great Pond before and slightly lower after. And interestingly, the dissolved oxygen concentrations are not that different. So even though the alum is there, we're still not, there's still a lot of oxygen depletion from the existing organic material that's in the pond. So that tells us it's actually a good thing we have the alum there, because otherwise that phosphorus would be being released, because the dissolved oxygen levels aren't improving, but the lower water phosphorus concentrations are improving. So this is what alum will do. It specifically addresses that source of the deep water phosphorus that's fluxing back from the sediments under low oxygen conditions. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question
Yes.
about that chart?
Yes.
Am I reading right that the clarity in Great Pond has gone down?
Yes. And you'll see that on this chart too.
Well, and actually, that chart also confused me because it looked like it was the best it was right before the treatment.
Right, 2012 was a great year. Yeah. But again, it was designed to address that specific source, and it really has. So think of this, if you think about Herring and Pond, think that Herring was a rehabilitation project. The pond was in really terrible shape, and we addressed it. In Great Pond, think of it as a water quality protection step, that proactively going forward, we understood that deep water phosphorus was an important source, And over the long run, it was going to degrade the pond. And because Great Pond is such a high value to the community, we wanted to address that source. It doesn't take us off the hook from addressing other sources, right? Still have to do best management practices for stormwater, for lawn care, for all kinds of things. But it is something that can be done, so we moved ahead with that. At a low dose. Okay, so now we're back to my 2018 update chart. So this is looking at, we last did our pond study, published in 2011, and in the back of it was a series of fact sheets, pond by pond. So part of what we did for this update, which Jane has in her files, and I'm sure we'll put them on the website, is an individual fact sheet for each of the 11 ponds as well. But here's our check mark. Remember the check mark? So check marks are good. Check marks say that you meet these criteria. Here's our 11 ponds. Here we are in alphabetical order. So here's our current 2018 status. And we kind of looked at that of, well, what does that mean compared to 2011? And we kind of compiled that into this chart of what's stable, what's getting better, and what's on the decline. So we see stable, Bridge, Great, which we just talked about, Jemima, Little Depot, and Muddy Pond seem to be in about the same condition they were in 2011. That's pretty good news, right? Because there have been changes. There's, the summers have been warmer. They have a longer growing season, typically on Cave as well as in many other places. The changes to the groundwater have, they'll take some time to be seen. So the fact that these ponds are stable is really positive. Herring, you saw that positive, the improving, compared to the pre-treatment. I mean, from what we're hearing from the abutters, maybe we're seeing more plants and algae in recent years than we have in previous years, so that's something we'll certainly keep a very close eye on. But then, we have the declining list, which is troubling. And I put Depot at the top of the list because of all of the ponds, we see the biggest loss in water quality occurring on Depot Pond. Widow Harding is also a little bit less attractive than it used to be in terms of algae growth and phosphorus concentrations. Malls Pond made the list because of it says HAB up here, that stands for harmful algal bloom. It's a short way of saying cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. That is confirmed, and that came through the health department, right? The sick dog, which is very typical. My husband's a veterinarian, and where we live in New York, last summer we had a lot of harmful algal blooms, and the Department of Health and the Department of Ag and Markets put out an emergency alert to all the veterinarians, telling them what to look for and to report whether animals are coming in with these symptoms and to find out which water bodies they've been playing in or swimming in or drinking from. So this is a problem, and the pets and domestic animals are a real early warning system for that. So we did see that in Malls Pond, and Malls is now on the Mass DEP watch list because of that harmful algal bloom. And then Minister Schoolhouse remained on the decline. They're not getting better. As I said, we've been thinking about and working on and really working hard on and investing in finding out more about Minister and Schoolhouse and what are some potential remedial measures for those ponds. And we're going to talk, that's a coming up section of my report to you today. Okay. So again, what's the universe of measures that can be used to treat these conditions? Alum, we talked about alum quite a bit. suitable for, you have a lot of algae, internal phosphorus is major, you have iron-rich phosphorus, or iron-rich sediments. Depot is actually in that list. It's a deeper pond, it does stratify, internal loading is very significant, so if that pond continues to decline and there's kind of a groundswell of support from the community for that, that might be a future project. Oxygenation, adding oxygen or air to the bottom of the ponds is an alternative. It helps interrupt that. Remember, I was describing the cycle, the chemical cycle of when sediments that are rich in iron-bound phosphorus are overlain by water without oxygen, that the chemical changes release the phosphorus to the water. So adding air or oxygen can disrupt that stratification plus add enough oxygen depending on the sizing and all of that, the oxygen demand to kind of interrupt that cycle. So we have a couple ponds that are good for that. Watershed best management practices, all the ponds, all of our resources really need help. And Sandy Bain provided a little handout here, 9 things that you can do for your pond, which are up here. A lot about lawn care, fertilization, maintaining septic systems, buffer zones, native plant buffer zones. What am I missing, Sandy?
Oh my goodness, give me the paper, I'll read it. No, they're
Clean up
handouts,
after your
they're
dog.
handouts, yeah.
Okay.
Clean up after your dog.
Thank you for doing that. And then dredging, which is pulling sediments out of the pond, or hydroraking, which is putting in a piece of equipment that kind of scoops out masses of aquatic plants and macrophytes and pulling them out of the pond in kind of near-shore areas. Those are also potential remedial measures. And here's what they would be suitable for. So we picked Muddy, Minister, and Schoolhouse as areas where that might be useful. It could be that Herring would join that list at some point. We'll keep an eye on that. Also, Mass DEP is keeping an eye on the ponds. So we have the PALS project, and we also have the regulatory agencies who are thinking about and analyzing whether the ponds, the weather water quality in all of our waters, the estuaries, in the lakes, the ponds, throughout the state of Massachusetts, do they meet the water quality standards associated with their best use? So if your best use is as a drinking water supply, then, is the water quality safe for drinking? So they compile results, they analyze it. Same with recreation, same with aquatic life. And then every couple of years, the Clean Water Act requires all the states to report back to EPA their list of impaired water bodies. So that's the list of waters where the water quality conditions don't meet their designated uses. And this list has multiple categories. And ponds in Eastham showed up in 2 of the categories. Category 2, unassessed, meaning we're worried but we don't have enough data, we, Mass DEP, and that has Herring and Depot on that list. Yes, don't ask me to think like a regulator because I
2
can't.
slides ago, though, you showed that Herring Pond went from 0.6 dissolved oxygen to 1.5, which is still very much below the 4 parts.
Correct.
So why is it not on the category 5
Because
as is
they-
Great Pond?
Because
There are
they think
two of
they...
the 4 checks we didn't get.
Right. There's, they don't have enough data apparently to
But they
make
measured
that.
the soil.
But the PALS, they have access to the PALS databases. It could be shortage of labor within the Mass DEP, that I know that happens in various states, to actually go through and analyze and report on all the conditions.
So it's not the local natural resources that are testing, it's the state.
The state compiles data that they get from local agencies and then makes this list. But in order to be, sometimes the local agencies have to be pretty proactive in getting information to the state. So this list comes out in draft in June. The September before, the state DEP in this case will send out a notice, or they'll post a notice on their website that if anybody has information, send it in because we're updating this list. So, you know, it's a regulatory process, but Great Pond and Malls Pond showed up as Category 5 waters, which means that Mass DEP believes that a TMDL, a total maximum daily load approach, is required to restore the ponds. So I bet many of you have heard the term TMDL tossed around because of the Massachusetts Estuary Program over the years, but we'll see if it's much more challenging to develop a TMDL for a pond that's affected by non-point sources and groundwater than it is for a water body that has a piped discharge from a treatment plant or something that you can set limits on. So I'm not sure how that's going to evolve, but it's something I'm just bringing and get to your attention because I think that the Water Management Committee and the Health Department and others should kind of pay a little bit of attention to this over the next couple of years. You have a question?
What is the TMDL stand for?
Total maximum daily load. So it's an allocation. First they do a study, and so they'll say, okay, in Great Pond, these are the sources of phosphorus, and they quantify them. So, 20 kilograms from internal loading, 60 kilograms from septic, 100 from stormwater runoff, whatever the numbers are. So they get the current conditions. Then they say, okay, given the properties of this pond in terms of its depth and its flushing rate, how much phosphorus can this pond safely assimilate while meeting water quality standards? So the numbers I just said added up to 160. Just nod at say they did. And so if DEP says, okay, 160 is too high, they need to get to 100. So then the TMDL will allocate that reduction to the various sources. They can say, okay, they've already addressed internal loading, so we can't take much more out of that, but there's still septic and runoff, so let's take 30 off of septic and 30 off of runoff, or that kind of. So that's what a TMDL is. It's very analogous to the process that was done for the estuaries, for figuring out what's a safe load, and then allocating it back to the various sources and assigning reductions and targets and timelines and responsible parties, and it's a very regulatory structured thing. So, but yeah.
Just a quick comment on that. It would be interesting with Great Pond, where you could divide up how much of it is public or town-owned versus private, but to have the state come in and say, okay, this percentage of whatever, septic or lawn, is going to be, how then do you get the private piece? It's
very challenging for non-point.
Yeah.
And especially with the fact that groundwater is the major source to these ponds makes it even more complicated. Okay.
That's what the Conservation Foundation.
So we had our updated prioritization now, and we're still at Minister and Schoolhouse. The ones that are in bold here have changed categories. So Depot was medium, and I put medium to high with a question mark because that's kind of a community conversation. Based on its degradation, it's probably somewhere on your upcoming priority list. Great Pond, it was high. We dropped it to medium because of the alum treatment, but then I put in it's on the part 5 of that list is called the 303D list, so, sorry, more jargon, I should have changed that. Herring was high, it's now low because of the good response, but again, we'll keep tracking that. Minister remains high. Malls I moved from low to medium because of the harmful algal bloom. So these are suggestions. This is something that the agencies and the committees will think about over the years to come. Okay. Whew. Part 2, salt pond. So we just talked about the TMDL, right? Total maximum daily load. So nitrogen is, because nitrogen is the limiting nutrient for the estuarine environment, the way phosphorus is for the salt. We have a nitrogen TMDL set for the entire Nauset estuary, and the restoration goal is to have water quality that supports the eelgrass bed expansions. So during the Mass Estuary Project and all of the modeling that was done for that, they decided that the threshold for nitrogen to meet that restoration goal for eelgrass should be 0.45 milligrams per liter. So that's, that's the goal. And then the modeling, the same modeling that we were talking about with how would you do a TMDL for Great Pond, that modeling was done for the Nauset estuary, estimating what the current nitrogen load is, the nitrogen load to achieve the target, and then set the load reductions across the various sources. And that work is ongoing and will be ongoing for a long time. It's the part of the whole comprehensive wastewater management projects on Cape Cod. So it's very important work. There's a lot of things that we have learned from doing that. But because the Nauset estuary is so large, there are various designated sentinel monitoring points within it, and Salt Pond in Eastham is one of those sentinel monitoring points. So that means that the sentinel monitoring points are visited bi-weekly during the summertime by volunteers trained by the SMAST, I believe.
5 times a year.
5 times a year.
5 times a year.
So bi-weekly during the summer, 5 visits a year, and do sampling at the sentinel monitoring points, just to see how are we doing with all of the work that's been going on. It's kind of an adaptive management feedback loop. So if we have data from 2003 to 2017 ready for the salt pond. So the target, as I said, is set at 0.45. That's the eelgrass related target. Think if nitrogen concentration is at 0.45 or below, there won't be enough algae to shade the eelgrass, right? So light has to penetrate deep enough into salt pond to let the eelgrass grow. So it's all working, it's this kind of the same way we've been thinking about the ponds, but now we're thinking about the estuaries. So here's our, how does it look? We're above the 0.45, consistently above the 0.45. There is some difference from year to year. 2013 was a very high year. So we're also looking at water clarity. So as I said, they take multiple samples per year. This is a double graph. So SDT stands for Secchi Disc Transparency. So that's our measure of water clarity. And just as in the ponds, lower bars mean you can see deeper into the water. So we have the average over the 5. And I also plotted the minimum because that's kind of an index of are there bloom conditions that happen. So that, algae, you don't have a constant concentration over the growing season. It's kind of they have a short life cycle. So they have booms and busts kind of cycles. So sometimes the minimum can be just as informative as the average. Same with chlorophyll. So again, we're looking at the pigment in the water from the algal cells. And this is on a log, whoops, sorry. Whoops. This is on a log scale here. So this is 1 to 10, this is 10 to 100, this is 10 to 1,000. And I plotted both the average and the maximum. Again, the maximum that captures your blooms. So you see that there's not a lot of improvement here yet, right? Yet. We have to be optimistic that all of the regulatory measures and engineering measures that have been put in place are actually going to change this chart over time. And dissolved oxygen in the deep water. That's another sentinel issue for the restoration of the estuary, because there's a lot of animals that live on the bottom of the estuary, right? And they need oxygen to survive. So if you want your estuary to be healthy, you need to have oxygen deep in the water. The concentration here, remember when I showed oxygen for the ponds, I talked about 4 milligrams per liter? Well, for the estuaries, the scientists like to see 6 milligrams per liter, because a fish can swim away from oxygen that's getting low, but crabs and mussels and things, they really can't move out of that. So,
In 2015, it looks like they had very little oxygen. Was there some event that happened?
that was the average in 2015. I don't have the direct answer to that, but this is also very affected by temperature and stratification, so, you know, and wind and blooms. So if we had in 2015, we had very severe red tide event.
That was my next question, is the
Yes.
red tide associated with this?
It is, because all of that algae, or cyanobacteria actually, in effect, of red tide, settles to the bottom, and that massive organic material uses up the oxygen. So you see a lot of differences from year to year that are related to weather too, and climate and weather different. So it's, you know, these are interesting signals, and luckily we have a lot of good, you know, scientists at the Estuary Project. Yeah.
Yeah. How many samples go into these annual numbers?
There are 5.
For the estuaries, there are 5 sampling events per year at specific tides and time of day for the entire program, which includes the Pleasant Bay Alliance program and also Nauset Estuary.
So that's the bar is the average over the 5 events. And this is in the deep water. And then this line up here shows the percentage of the 5 measurements that met, or no, actually that violated the 6 milligram per liter standard. So it goes from 0 to 100. So you see that in 2015, when the average was this low, all of those were under 6. But also in 2016, even as the average crept up, they're still 100% under 6. So very stressful to the benthic community. We had 80% of the 2017 samples. So 4 out of the 5 samples were under the 6 milligrams per liter in 2017. So this is a really well-designed program, because they do account for tidal cycle, and you know, they have very well-trained volunteers to do this. So, you know, this is an invaluable data set. Okay, that's it for Salt Pond. No good news yet, basically. So let's talk a little bit, this is the last, about Minister Schoolhouse, because I said that, you know, this is our priority. The town has worked with Solitude, which used to be well, Solitude is a very big lake management firm, and they acquired ACT, the Aquatic Control Technology, which was the group that had done our alum treatments. So they've captured a lot of real local expertise, and they worked in both 2017 and 2018 on Schoolhouse in Minister Pond. They did a plant survey and discovered that there's really a very high diversity of macrophytes, rooted aquatic plants in the Minister Schoolhouse complex. They're all native species. That's good news. You know, we don't have invasive macrophytes. They did a water quality survey, so to supplement the work that has been done by the PALS and the PCCS, which PCCS samples in the spring, PALS samples at the end of the season. They did a couple sampling in between in both basins, the Minister Basin and Schoolhouse Basin. And they also, fortunately, discovered that there were invasives, there were Stanza phragmites, which is a very aggressive common reed, it's called, which is an invasive species that was on the edges of the pond. And in 2018, they designed a program to continue monitoring to understand the nutrient dynamics. They did additional water quality monitoring. They did it this time both in the surface water and right over the sediments, so we could kind of look at that, how that changes over the years. They repeated their macrophyte survey, but they did it a little bit later in the season. The June survey was a little early. For some of the plants hadn't quite emerged, so they moved it a little bit later in the season. They treated the shoreline phragmites, and they also they took sediment samples from the bottom and did some of the testing similar to what we had done for Great Pond and Herring Pond prior to the alum treatment program, to see if that was a potential remedial measure that could work for that pond. They also looked at how deep into the sediment do the macrophytes extend their roots, just to kind of verify what's the nutrition source, what's the phosphorus that's supporting all of these macrophytes that are so interfering to recreational use of the pond. So here's the sediment phosphorus data, and I put it in a table with what we had from before for Great Pond and Herring Pond. So Minister and Schoolhouse, the total phosphorus concentrations are pretty different. They're on the low side, but then they also measured the iron-bound phosphorus, because again, remember, the alum targets the iron-bound phosphorus. So those concentrations were much higher than Great Pond, but lower than herring. So that gives us some really important information to move forward if we think that alum is a potential remedial measure for a shallow pond. The shallow ponds are really challenging. The alum treatment programs that have been done on Cape Cod have generally been very successful, and they have all targeted deeper ponds. So the alum treatment program for the shallow ponds would be something kind of a pilot treatment, maybe a way that we can learn about, is that a reasonable and effective treatment program for our shallower ponds. There are many, many ponds on the Cape that are shallow and are exhibiting water quality problems.
What's the average depth on a shallow pond versus a deep in your?
Okay, in my kind of arbitrary dividing line, if the maximum depth of a pond is deeper than about between 25 and 30 feet, then that's a deep pond to me. Shallower than that, it's a shallow pond. So it's just kind of, and that's based on kind of the physics of the stratification. And it depends on the ponds. So some ponds that are very sheltered, like Minister Schoolhouse Pond, even though they're not that deep, they still undergo thermal stratification because the winds are just not strong enough to mix that water from top to bottom. So it depends on their geologic setting, their depth, their fetch, the direction with respect to prevailing winds, all kinds of factors.
What is the maximum depth of the two basins? I've only been there for 40 years, so I don't know. Well, I don't know that, but
I do know.
It's
18
yes,
and
16 to 18.
16 to 18?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so,
And that's at the deepest part in the two basins?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Over my head.
over your head, definitely. Over 3 of you. No.
Yes.
Yes, okay, wait, do the math. Okay, so the 2018 report has just been finalized and released to the town. And here their major findings is that even though the, macrophytes really are an impairment to recreational use and access, but it's really just a very narrow band around the ponds. We have a map of density that shows that those are near shore, and as soon as you go offshore by maybe they said 5 to 7 feet is kind of the maximum growth of where you're going to get macrophytes. Again, because the water's fairly turbid and full of algae, the light doesn't penetrate to the bottom of the pond. So that's something you have to think about, that if we do an alum treatment and clear up some of the algae, maybe the light will penetrate more deeply into the pond, and then you'll start to get more plant growth. But so elevated chlorophyll A, so there is enough algae to make the ponds kind of unattractive for recreational use. They don't look inviting that you're going to jump out of your kayak and take a dip, basically. That there's a relatively shallow organic layer over a very hard sandy bottom. These ponds are kettle ponds. They're formed by ice blocks breaking off the glacier, and so you have a very hard sand bottom. And then the organic material that's accumulated over the last 10,000 years or so is overlying that, but it's not that, it's maybe 4 to 6 inches deep. And that the sediments, as I showed you in that last chart, the sediments have fairly low to moderate concentrations of phosphorus. Yeah.
Your point about more macrophytes if there's more light, but if at the same time we're increasing the oxygenation over the phosphorus and perhaps through alum actually binding it, shouldn't that mean less phosphorus will be released? So that might somewhat, it won't completely stop the macrophytes from growing, but it may reduce the rate of growth?
It may be helpful. Macrophytes tend to get their nutrition from the sediments, not from the overlying water. So the fact that that phosphorus comes back from the sediments into the water column largely affects the algae. So, what is to be done, right? We had a conference call with Solitude last Friday. We had gone over their reports and said, so what's your recommendation? What should we be doing now? We've been working on this, we've been thinking about it, we've been studying it for a while. What can we do for action? And phase 1, which would be kind of this summer, which is a hydro raking project, which is kind of a little digging machine that pulls up the dense macrophytes by their roots, puts them in the shoreline into a large dumpster, lets it dewater, and then dispose of that upland somewhere away from the direct watershed. Solitude said that they typically work with the DPWs in the municipalities for help with this, and also for ideas about disposal sites. So that's something that is their recommendation, and something that we reached consensus on that should be done. They also are recommending aeration because of the oxygen depletion within the ponds. They're recommending installing an aeration system. Now, aeration is a very standard, long-established remedial measure for water bodies, typically smaller ones. It's a forever project in a way. It has a shoreline compressor with tubes and pipelines that extend into the very deep basins of the ponds. So the compressor pumps air into the bottom. There are the last bit of the pipeline tubing that's going into the pond is perforated. So the bubbles come out of that and then they dissolve into the water, essentially. That's a simple explanation. Any questions on that? So that would be to address, so hydroraking would address the macrophytes, aeration would address the oxygen depletion, and to be vigilant about the Phragmites. Because once that takes over, it's very, very hard to control.
Excuse me again. You say what is the treatment? What is it? Is it a chemical? Is it a?
Yes.
You spray it or?
Yes.
Do not spray it.
Sort of waved a soap drag, if you will. They drag it across the Phragmites, so there was contact. It wasn't aerial sprayed. It was very contained and controlled application.
Oh, okay. And then phase 2, we're going to kind of move ahead with these recommendations and keep an alum treatment program on the table, but maybe wait and see how effective this all is before recommending that. But keeping phase 2 on the docket and hopefully able to get regulatory approvals for that.
And maybe you're going to get to this, but I see when the prevention part of it, preventing the continued or ongoing degradation through things that humans can control, abutters can control, users can control, that should be in every phase of, when you put that up as recommendations and it's missing, to me, that's a huge gap, because this will be, taxpayer money, somebody's money, it's a lot of work, and yet it's treatment and not prevention, not with prevention ongoing through education, whatever. We do have in town, we have fertilizer regulations, but it's more of a, and what would you call it, Jane? Suggestions. Their enforcement is, it's how do we really get some of these things that we are the cause of directly, get more teeth in we're putting out this, we're trying to fix this problem, but we don't want to do the Far Side cartoon of that thing floating down and they're, rescuing people out of the waterfall and there's people just throwing them in up further upstream.
Yeah,
That's
well, The first presentation on the status of the ponds, the recommendations there covered everything, including the best management practices, which would be what we can do as people.
Right.
Now, all that Liz is identifying right now is what Solitude recommended as its treatment plan.
No, and
so
I think-
obviously going forward,
Right.
we'd be doing both.
Right, and I think that's great. I just think
Make
what
sure that
happens
that
is.
message is clear
Right.
as we communicate with the public about
Yeah,
this. Yes.
absolutely.
Great,
Thanks.
great response. Thank you.
There was a discussion, some emails back and forth, about the storm drain from Route 6, which goes directly into the pond. And I've heard, I don't know, somebody said somebody or some expert said that's a huge part of the problem in the pond, that if you don't fix that,
Right.
you're kind of shoveling sand against the tide. Seal was very polite about that.
Yeah.
So I don't know, is there, I know Sarah
That's part of
McPeak,
it.
I guess, has taken a look at it or been involved in it. One, how serious is that issue? Two, does anybody know what's going to happen with it, or is there any movement on it?
I can address that. Liz established a wide range in the Pond Action Plan from 2011 that might be coming from the source of the stormwater. It was 29 to 60.
60.
Yeah, so it's a pretty wide range. We do certainly know that that is a source of nutrient loading that is happening. So we did meet with Sarah Peak, Sharon Chipley, and some others from the town, talking with Mass State Highway and the Cape Cod Commission about that outfall. So we are trying to put pressure on them, if not out of the kindness of their heart, politically, and to try to find some resources for them, some source of funding through, maybe Sarah suggested, maybe the environmental bond bill. But in my budget for the upcoming year, I've asked for money for conceptual design for a stormwater system there to bioremediate, if you will, before there's release to the pond. We think that there is a location there that might work, but before we can fund this project, a conceptual design would be helpful, to get this going down the road. So my ultimate desire would be to have Mass DOT come in and do it all, but we're not confident that that will be the case. So this is what I suggested might be a good strategy going forward. And also on the elementary school side, we do have a engineering design plan, and in the budget for next year, I've requested money that would include construction. So we're hoping that internally, our DPW could actually do a lot of that work, if not all of that work. We do have
This could be around
construction.
the boat launch, the
That's
fisherman's
correct.
landing area.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So there's still effort that needs to be achieved there, but we are looking at this as a total project. So there's no easy fix, as Liz said. It is somewhat of a pilot that we hope will be a model for other shallow ponds. Some of this we hope is transferable. What we learn here through our successes, hopefully, and not our failures. But it's a challenge, and that I'm just straight out honest about. This water body is very challenging. So those are, some of the work effort that is ongoing, and we hope we can get some of this done in this calendar year.
Just one thing, the hydro raking, is this something that you have to set up a schedule every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years? I assume that this is not you're not making this a vast wasteland, so you've got to come back and do it again on a periodic basis?
Yes, exactly. Because of the importance of macrophytes in the pond ecology, as we talked about before, for stabilizing sediments and providing habitat for fish and macroinvertebrates, it's not reasonable to take out all of the macrophytes. So what the design presumably would be is to identify areas where the macrophytes are most problematic in terms of access, and also to ensure that there's no protected plants in there. We've done 2 macrophyte surveys now. We're pretty confident that we know what's in that plant community, but again, you'd have to check and make sure there's no state protected plants in there. And then that would have to go through conservation. So it'll be a balance. You'll want to leave islands so that there'll be refuge areas for fish, and also kind of a seed bank for restabilizing that sediment surface after the hydro raking is complete.
And would you have to come back again, say 5 years and kind of look at it again? Or this is one.
Probably.
Yeah.
I mean,
But we get to that. Let's do it
Yeah.
once.
Yeah, go ahead.
So their recommendation, none of the money or agreement has been allocated by the town. at this point, right?
The Water Management Committee has filed an application to the Community Preservation Committee for funding. That was based on the preliminary discussions. We will be submitting a final application prior to their meeting February 6th, which is in the evening. Obviously, if any of you who are interested are able to attend that meeting, it would be helpful possibly to show your support for what we're proposing. Basically, our application is taking the Solitude recommendations and saying this is what we would like the Community Preservation Committee to fund, and then we also have breakdowns of the costs. So we'll have, as soon as we get the final information, breakdowns of what those costs will be. And then it's up to the Community Preservation Committee to decide whether or not to fund it. If they do that recommendation and approved by the selectmen, that recommendation will be on the May town meeting and will have to be approved by town meeting. If that all goes as hoped, the money would then be available on July 1, because that's when the fiscal year starts.
So February and May are important.
Yeah, the February 6th CPC meeting and the May town meeting.
And then when permitting begins,
Yeah,
the whole project
Conscom,
will have to
yeah.
go to conservation.
Which is
for
another
their-
date that will be important. And
Right.
that's why, one of the reasons we collected emails. We'll let you all know when the meetings are.
Thank you.
The Community Preservation Committee has been very supportive of projects in the past. They have recommended them and town meeting has approved them, spending money for it.
Yeah, is there any data on the transit of the excessive nutrients through groundwater, so that we can understand where they're coming from? In other words, is it only the direct abutters to the water bodies, or is it more of it's just living on a sandbar infused with water?
So that's why we have this map here. These are the contributing watersheds. So you can see that this has Minister Schoolhouse in it. Here's the direction of groundwater flow. So it goes from Minister Schoolhouse through Salt Pond and then out to the Nauset through the Salt Bay. And there's a lot of really good detailed hydrogeologic information about the groundwater movement and flux and sources within here.
So, I mean, the point of my question really was, I know you have a fertilizer regulation that people aren't very aware of, I think. And as Joanna was saying, it sort of doesn't have a lot of teeth to it. Is there a need for more education of people who aren't like direct butters about the importance of minimizing, eliminating some of their habits of creating septics and that sort of thing?
Absolutely.
We did the brochure that the Water Management Committee completed in, help me with the date here, it's in the last 5 years, I forget what it was. That was mailed to every pond abutter of every pond. And, thank you. And, we completed it in January 2014, and it contains a lot of that information about what you can do to help your pond. And it was mailed, I would say, from private funds to every pond abutter, every owner of a pond abutting residence at that time. And I think one of the things we're going to be looking at in this coming year is how can we update, upgrade, and maybe get better distribution of that.
Yeah, because my point was really, it's not just the direct butters, it was this point, the watershed concept.
Well, it was, what we could afford to do.
Isn't widely known.
We weren't
Yeah,
up
I
to
think
doing
that's
the
true.
for the whole
Yeah.
town.
I would say, it's an ongoing educational process that we need to continue to reach out to the community. We did hold, I thought, a very instructive session this summer. We invited horticulturist to come down from the Cape Cod Extension Service, and we talked about rain gardens, we talked about fertilizers, we talked about homeowner, what a homeowner can do, but there's always room for more education and outreach. And it's a message we cannot repeat often enough. So there's a lot we can do individually as departments, I think, collectively as a community. And, you know, it is, I think, by the fact that you're all here today, I think there is a lot of support for protecting our resources, which is a great, great thing. And, you know, we just have to keep that going. We have to keep getting better at it, because we are investing a lot of money in restoration, and we want the best possible outcome. So it's going to be a little of this and a little of that, hopefully, to end up with the result that we hope to see.
Yeah, I should add, actually, I might have left the impression we only gave it to Ponderosa. It was mailed to Ponderosa. It was distributed at various places throughout the town for various summers. We had it at the information booth, we had it at Brown's, we had it at the library, we had it at Town Hall, so that we distributed, I would say, a few thousand copies throughout the town. But obviously, we can do better and
There is
do
one
more.
good thing that's happened, and that is that about 5 years ago, the state banned the use of phosphorus, the inclusion of phosphorus in many fertilizers. So that if you go to Agway and you want to buy a lot of phosphorus, you're not going to be able to do it. So that helps protect us whether we know it or not.
But then my father has this huge thing, because they were just banned it, and he bought a whole stock of it, so, and I'm sort of half joking, I don't think he did that, but he does, but there's a lot of things, oh, they don't get, you can't get this anymore. Chlordane, oh my gosh, it's in our basement. So,
Great.
but that's a good point, moving forward, it is getting harder to.
You better not have too much fertilizer in your basement, that can get you on a bad
Right,
list.
fertilizer, that's the, yeah, the mental.
Question in the back.
I'm for the Old Age Pond Coalition, and we're trying something new that Sandy knows about. And it's a side stream oxidization process. And we're doing it at Sarah's Pond in Long Beach. It's a small pond with 5 stakeholders that own property around the pond. So we deliberately got a small pond, and it has 2 pools in it, one which we will oxygenate, and the other one, we know that there's going to be some overlap into that, but we're hoping that we have enough non-oxygen in that one to get 2 readings out of that pond. And this is a 2-year project. And the first, Solitude is one of the people involved in this, as is Ken Wagner. And we're hoping that what we will do in the 2-year process is the first year, we will be able to show some degree of improvement in the water. The second year, we want to validate the fact that we got those results the first year. And at that point, OPC backs out of this whole thing, and the system is available to anybody that wants to use it at that point. And we think that this is probably the first thing in 50 years and is new in the toolbox.
True. Yes, I've been reading about it in the local press, thanks to links that Adele's been sending around. It sounds really exciting. I mean, we'll see what
We hope
happens.
so.
Yeah, and I like the
We've got
idea
a lot of
that
money
it's
invested in this one.
yeah, but kind of as a proof of concept or proof of technology, and the fact that you're sharing all that information across the Cape and with other communities is going to be really helpful.
I hope so.
Yes.
Get back to Herring Pond, because I live on it. But as I said, I fish Herring Pond. I go to the next town in Wellesley, there's a pond called Gull Pond, which is a little larger than herring. But herring come into Gull Pond, they come to Herring Pond, spawn. The Gull Pond, the water quality is superb compared to Herring Pond. But if you look all the people that live around, there is not one trophy lawn there. in Wellfleet.
That's interesting.
It's in the seashore, isn't it? It's in the
Yeah.
seashore.
Yeah, Gull
And I
Pond
can
is in
tell
the
you if I
seashore. It
put
does
my-
have abutters, but not many.
If I, yeah, well, there's quite a few, but I can wait
Not when you're in
out
the pond and looking
on,
at it.
on Gull Pond, and I can look down, if I'm up to here in the water, I can see my feet.
See your feet, yeah.
In
This-
in herring, I cannot.
Yeah.
But I have a question
Sure.
on Herring Pond again. I've been living here for 20 years, and for the first 10 years, when we had the high moon tides, the water from the ocean would run into Herring Pond. Is that good or bad? I mean, it would run in and then go out
And then
again.
flush out, yeah.
Is that good or bad? I mean, it's salt water coming in, but
Right. Good or bad for
not for the water quality.
the water
or-
quality?
For which?
Yeah.
Because
Because
from
bridge
now,
ponds. same
But
way
now,
as the
now
herring
that doesn't
ponds.
happen, right?
but the thing is closed now all the time.
What's closed? The boards.
There's a board there,
Yeah.
and even.
So you're thinking maybe the flood, that changed the flushing, right? If that seawater would come in and entrain some of that fresh water, and then as it moved out, it might take some phosphorus-enriched water with it. In the past, I
Oh,
mean,
no, I've been complaining about to take that thing off when the high tide comes because of little herring. We were born in Herring Pond. They want to get out, but there's a board there, they cannot get out. And so the birds and the fish eat the little herring and none go out.
That's regulated
Yeah.
by the Natural Resources
Oh, I
Department.
understand, yes, but.
So I don't have a, they're not
No,
here.
no, I'm just saying that this is, I don't understand that, but I just wondered if the water coming in would.
I can
Changes.
add that we did have that astronomically bad storm in March where the ocean, I've never seen it ever happen, flooded in and actually went over the herring run. And so a lot of that storm water, was discharged into the pond. It was an astronomically unusual event. But that certainly isn't a good thing to happen, but it did happen.
Charles.
I can add a little information here. The folks down in Orleans are working on a better water quality for Cedar Pond, which sits beside Route 6. And that pond has experienced occasional saltwater inflow. So if you sought information for Cedar Pond, you'd probably find out what they're thinking about saltwater.
Are there any other questions? Well, I want to thank Liz for,
I'd like to make one
sure,
more
go ahead,
comment.
Charles.
I did ask the Massachusetts Department of Transportation for any engineering design documents they had for the stormwater flow down to Route 6 into Mr. Schoolhouse Pond. And they were very cooperative. They sent me 3 or 4 sheets. And if you look at the sheets, and they are engineered design drawings, the date on it is 1938.
Oh, good.
So,
Thank
we
you.
think about it, okay, and sure enough, they show that
Yeah.
large 18-inch diameter ceramic pipe discharging down
Right there.
at pond level. Well, just think about that. I mean, we're now in 2019, but we have had 80 years of stormwater coming down from Route 6 into the pond. My thoughts are that fixing that situation with some type of rain garden bioabsorber is important, but we're having to push back 80 years worth of discharge down here, so it's going to take a while. Just
Good
my
point.
thoughts.
Good point.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you, Liz, very much for
Great questions.
love our
Good
ponds.
discussion.